We'll now move on to the sharing of our seasoned media practitioners tungkol po sa kanilang experiences in reporting or writing about forced labor and trafficking cases in their respective fields. First off is Miss Buena Bernal, a correspondent of Channel News Asia. She's based here in the Philippines, and she started in journalism as a multimedia reporter for Rappler, covering stories on court and the justice system, labor and migration, health, and other development issues. So prior to her current post at Channel News Asia, she served as a freelance journalist for different agencies such as CNN International Asia Pacific, Union of Catholic Asian News, Asia Sentinel, and Al Jazeera English. At dahil po malapit sa puso niya ang often underreported labor rights issues, she also created Workers of PH, an online platform for stories tungkol po sa daily grind, struggles, at determination of our Filipino workers. So please welcome Ms. Buena Bernal.
All right, so I'll start with the presentation with practical tips on funding, psychological aid, and of course, the actual coverage of the exploitation undergone by our Filipino fishermen. And I'll just talk over this report. It's muted, so I'll just summarize it. So we've already been acquainted with the hazardous working conditions of our Filipino fishermen, as explained earlier by Sir Anton. But on top of that, you also have to look at the context, because that sashimi grade tuna caught by Filipino fishermen, they often end up on the dining tables of the developed world, right? Like the US and Europe. And that's the context that we're looking at right now. So on top of months at a time in the deep sea, the lack of access to clean water, protective gear, worker-related benefits and social protections, including for possible disabilities due to their occupational hazards. On top of that, you have the context that the market here has some level of awareness, right? In fact, these are markets that boycott certain companies because of reported labor issues. On top of that context, you also have the dwindling fish population. And in General Santos City, for example, these fishermen often end up reaching Indonesian waters because of the dwindling fish catch here in the Philippines, and there they can get caught for illegally fishing. And the point of that is to say that the issue of exploitation of our deep sea fishermen intersects with many other issues. Let me go back to the slide. And that is where intersectionality comes at play, right? The labor angle can work alongside other angles as well, including the environment. You have the climate change, you can report on sustainable forms of fishing, and then you can also look at other stakeholders. And one of the challenges when you're reporting on these forms of exploitation is that a lot of the people involved, even those subjected to these hazardous conditions, actually have considered the system that perpetuates these conditions as customary practices. It's been normalized to them. So these are things that they have eventually come to accept. So it's the same challenge in awareness raising, right? It needs education of those involved, but it also needs education of yourself as a journalist. You need to be informed of how the institutions, the stakeholders work, to be able to report on it and to be able to help clean up the supply chains, because ultimately that is the goal. We're here also to be able to help change certain systems. So we need to be informed of those nuances in the institutions involved. Now, you can also look at other stakeholders, like the community response to the issue. For example, in this story, I talk about the community sharing of bycatch, how fishermen who return from months-long fishing expeditions, they often share the bycatch that they have in their villages, in their barangays, to their neighbors, because a lot of these people are in deep debt while waiting for the breadwinner to return from those months-long fishing expedition. You can also look at other stakeholders involved that are already marginalized apart from the issue here, right? Because when you look at issues of marginalized segments, and then on top of that, you have that they are involved in they are involved in some way, um, or suffering in some way from the issue of exploitation in the fishing industry, that means they're now facing multiple layers of suffering. So again, we go back to intersectionality, meaning these issues exist alongside each other, overlap, and therefore merong multiple layers ng paghihirap ng mga stakeholders involved. So for example, in every issue, I always look at the women involved. So not just the fishermen, but the wives they've left behind, because often these are women who have been housewives all their lives. So now with the breadwinner, for example, here detained in Indonesia because of illegally fishing there, um, they're now left to fend for their family, and they oftentimes they don't have the skill set that match with available jobs in the community, and now they have that additional emotional and financial burden. So intersectionality means that a lot of these issues intersect with each other, and we have to be able to report on that context as well. One of the challenges in reporting, of course, on issues like this is also what we call vicarious traumatization. And this is a reason why a lot of us feel distressed right now during the pandemic, because online we see a lot of suffering, jobs lost, returning overseas Filipino workers. And by witnessing and hearing about a lot of these trauma, we also sort of internalize a level of trauma. So that is vicarious traumatization. And a lot of journalists go through this because they listen to other people's suffering, on a prolonged basis. And the way to deal with that challenge is to not only learn, because journalists oftentimes are given basic first aid training, or I also recommend hostile environment training. Apart from that, you can also learn psychological first aid. And I know that funding is almost always an issue, right, in the journalism industry in the Philippines. So you can look for guidance on resources on mental resilience. For example, these are free resources from the DART Center Asia Pacific. You can look at free resources from the International Center for Journalists. You can look at for hostile environment training, which I know is no longer within the scope of this, but I also want to share resources from the Institute for War and Peace Reporting, from the International News Safety Institute. If you're a freelancer, from the Rory Petra, or if you're a stringer for other news agencies, international agencies, you can look at Frontline Club, which runs the Frontline Freelance Register. I think these types of training are very important for journalists who are exposed to other people's trauma. And on top of that, you can also be desensitized, right? If every day or every now and then you're exposed to certain trauma of other people, then maybe you should also take a mental health break, and maybe also look at some empowering stories, not just the stories of the quote unquote victims. Now, I want to highlight three particular media trends, because these trends often affect how we report on issues that require in-depth reporting. And you journalists, you know about these trends, but for the sake of media literacy, um, for the non-media practitioners, you have to understand that journalists report based on beats, and especially in Metro Manila, you have, for example, the Malacanang beat, the House of Representatives beat. That means that every day, as you submit your stories, you're required to show up with stories from that particular agency. So the problem with that is sometimes your reporting becomes dictated by press conferences and press releases instead of you setting the agenda for the audience, right? Another media trend in terms of reporting issues that require special reports is that we're often driven by the news of the day. There's a news cycle. So, for example, now the news cycle is, of course, the aftermath of Typhoon Bamko, local name Typhoon Dulisis. And because of that, because we trace the news and we do the news every day, and there's so many tasks involved, sometimes we present the news in nuggets, right? It's the breaking news online often times involve 6-paragraph stories, and that's also a problem when you're looking at issues of trafficking in persons and forced labor in the seas that require some level of depth and some level of time and resources to focus on it. The same is true with fact journalism, right? A lot of our news reports are homogeneous. The same with the other agency. Why? Because we rely on these press releases. So, for example, when when DOJ is able to rescue this and that person from trafficking and from a cell, for example, and then we're able to report on that from the press releases. And the point of that is to say that if we want to report on issues like trafficking in persons, trafficking in persons, sorry, there. If we want to report on issues like trafficking in persons and forced labor in the seas, that we should have the funding for it. And this is a challenge, number one, for newsroom managers, and number two, also for funding sources like international non-government organizations. So if you're a newsroom manager, the challenge is for you to be able to allocate resources to underreported stories. Because if a reporter A is going to look at this issue, he will have to focus on that for a couple of days or weeks, and he might not be able to focus on his day-to-day tasks, right? It's also a challenge for funding sources because they can also, for example, initiate media fellowships that will provide story grants to local journalists who have story proposals that have merit. So it's a challenge for the entire ecosystem to be able to raise awareness on these issues. And it's also a challenge for us journalists because the competition now is not just the competition between two reporters from two different agencies. The competition really here is against all the sources of information and entertainment that a consumer has. So, for example, your consumer would rather watch Netflix than maybe read a report about trafficking in persons and forced labor in the seas. Or, for example, your consumer would rather go to the neighbor and play cards, or not the neighbor right now because of the pandemic, but perhaps go to a friend within the same household and just play cards. So the challenge really is to draw the attention of the consumer to the news content. And that's not just a competition between and among news reporters. That's a competition against all other sources of information. And that is where the challenge for the journalist comes at play. So the challenge is garnering that funding, having that funding source available to begin with, and for the journalist, focusing on what can be done. And these are just a few slides on basic things that we need to learn or to take into consideration when covering these stories, right? I will just go through them very quickly. So an in-depth analysis of the institutions are very important. Respecting the survivor, very important. Using empowering language, instead of calling them victims, we call them survivors in our stories. And again, working with stakeholders. Perhaps as a last anecdote for this presentation is really, I remember reporting on an issue of a laborer being detained. I was already there, and then within the supply chain is a multinational corporation that is tapping that local company that was hiring the laborer, okay? So I was already there, and they were negotiating after the detention for some compensation and for reinstatement. And I already had the story when the local company said, okay, we will correct our wrongs, but can you not report on this? because we were already emailed by the MNC, the multinational corporation, about it to deal with it, or else they will cut their contract with the local company. So I said, okay, I will not report on it, but you have to make good with your promise. And because they did, that story never came out, even though my newsroom then already allocated the resources for the story. I already went out of town for it. I refused to disclose the story because for me the goal is to help change systems. So if that company will correct its ways, for me, if my reporting will become a hindrance to that correction, then I would rather choose reform over a story that, as we know, might get caught in the myriad of news cycles. So in conclusion, I think we are human beings first before we are journalists, and reforms in the system is more important than journalistic stories on print or air. So that ends my presentation.